Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Queer.Love.Light. This is Desiree coming to you on this beautiful, beautiful Friday. I have a treat for you today. We have a guest, Nick, who is a holistic therapist, psychotherapist, and certified hypnotherapist, daydreamer, magical mystic, mystical man. You're going to find out more about this very, very amazing, amazing queer spirit. That's what he calls all of us, because his work is in healing the queer spirit. So, welcome, Nick. I'm not going to attempt to even pronounce your last name, which is why I did not. So, forgive me. But welcome. How do you pronounce your last name? By the way,
It's Nick Venegoni.
Venegoni. Welcome,
Yeah.
welcome, Nick. So, Queer Love Light is a queer portal to share wisdom and insights, practical tools, to activate our inner self healing powers and, raise our collective consciousness. So, I think you are in the right place and the right time with me and Nick today, because Nick is definitely one of those people out there that are doing what I just said, which is helping people heal and raising their consciousness by helping them heal their spirit. I love your website, by the way, Nick. It's so inspiring. Heal your queer spirit, find your path to wellness and joy, and connect to your own inner wisdom and guidance. I love that.
Thank
That's where I come from. In terms of my own healing journey and also my vocation as a healing practitioner as well. So, Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you, first of all, get started on this path? And when you discovered this passion of healing, did it start from, I want to heal, only queer people, or where did it all come from? That passion of serving the community.
you. Yeah. So I usually start by answering this question by joking that this is my third career. That I went to undergrad school and I studied graphic design, and I did that for a while, and then that sort of fell away. And then I went into theater production work, and I worked at the San Francisco Opera for a couple years. And then, that was fine, but I felt like there was kind of something missing a little bit from my life and was just searching. And was at the time was taking some classes in astrology and tarot. I had always been interested in different kinds of um, alternative spiritual practices. My great aunt was really into astrology, so she used to talk to me about astrology growing up. So that was kind of my introduction to that. But I don't know if you've ever formally studied astrology, but it's quite complicated.
Oh, I can
So
only
it was
imagine. Yeah.
fun. Yeah, it was fun, but I was just like, well, I don't know that I'm going to become an astrologer, but it's something interesting. But when I was taking those classes, one of my astrology teachers, I had lunch with her one day, and I said, I don't really know what I want to do, and this theater production thing is not very stable, and I'm not sure about it. And she said, "Oh, well, have you ever heard of transpersonal psychology?" And I said, "No." And she told me about it. And transpersonal psychology is just kind of one of the many branches of psychology that has a more holistic and spiritual kind of perspective, without a religious perspective per se. And so, yeah, I was just really interested in that, and looked into it and decided to go to grad school to become a therapist. And it was like my late 20s when I started grad school, and I had already been out for, you know 8, 9, 10ish years, somewhere around there. And when I first started grad school, I wasn't really thinking so much about who I wanted to work with. I was just like, oh, well, this is the work that I want to do. And then, as I was starting to um, intern and get my hours and actually work face to face with clients, was when I thought more about like who I wanted to work with. And I found that, interestingly, I worked well with straight men too, and I still do have a number of clients who are straight men, and but the majority of my clients have always been people who identify somewhere in the queer spectrum. And so, being in San Francisco in the Bay Area, there's lots of queer people here, and people here are also very open to therapy and counseling. And so it's not been difficult to support that community. Um, and then after getting licensed and sort of building my practice for a while, I wanted to start reaching out to more people. And so I thought about other ways to do that, like, doing workshops and offerings and that kind of thing. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about transpersonal therapy, because I've never heard of it before. And when I heard about it from you, it was very
Mhm.
intriguing to me. And how does that inform, your practice? And
Mhm.
then what else have you kind of like brought into the mix to make it your own?
Yeah. So transpersonal psychology, if you think about just the word, if you think about like transgender, there's a way in which there's this transition, that happens, right? And then there's also like transit or transportation, meaning sort of moving through and beyond, right? So transpersonal psychology is about like how is there a transformation or a transition within the personal, but also a transit moving through and beyond, right? So there's it's including the self, but also including more beyond the self. So in some ways, like what is beyond us is, the universe, is God, is spirit, is the divine, that kind of thing. Or for some people, they find connection through spirit or the divine through the earth, a lot of earth-based spiritual practices. Um, and so how do we look at what's happening for the person, but also how do we find support and guidance for people outside of themselves? What are they, what kinds of support systems that they use, whether it be a spiritual practice or a religious community, that kind of thing. And so transpersonal psychology is really an integrative type of psychology that uses a variety of things, so I'm open to referring clients to a network of other practitioners in conjunction with our work together. So that may be working with a nutritionist or an herbalist. A lot of people come to me because they don't really want to start by taking medication. And I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't prescribe medication, but sometimes people may need medication. But people really want to try to find something that is more natural before
More
they try
holistic,
something.
more
Exactly.
holistic. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So
Yeah, that's. Mhm.
or they may try acupuncture or some other kind of body work like chiropractic or massage, or even energy work like Reiki. Um, and so those are the kinds of things that I may talk to people about. And then I also look at the whole person. I look at them body, mind, and spirit. And so I'm not a nutritionist myself, but a lot of us know, at least in the health and wellness field, we know basics about health and nutrition. So I talk to people about their basic nutrition, like what is their diet like,
Mhm.
um, especially for people who have anxiety. I often will check in about like how much sugar are they consuming, how much caffeine are they consuming, because that can really affect our energy and our anxiety. I ask people about their sleep, but I also ask people about dreams and nightmares. That's
Right.
something that we often don't think about, is how is our unconscious and our subconscious telling us, giving us information, or as one of my teachers says, that dreams are email from the unconscious, right? They're
I love
messages
that.
that our unconscious is sending into the conscious. And if we can hold on to the dream into the waking world, into our waking day, we can get information about what's happening for us.
Mhm. Yes, that's so refreshing to hear, that you have this very holistic approach to your service, and that you're holding workshops, to help people also through the process. It's not just coming to uh, consultations. That's what I'm seeing as well. So thank you for sharing that. So, can I ask you, on your own journey, what was your own experience with therapy? Like, before you studied it to, as a profession, what was your own experience, before coming into this?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I didn't have a whole lot of my own therapy before I started school. A lot of people like they become a therapist because they've been in therapy for so long and they're like, "Oh, I really appreciated the work that my therapist did for me and I want to do that for someone else." I saw a therapist on my college campus when I was in school when I was just starting to come out, but I really only went for like I think 2 or 3 sessions.
Hmm.
And I just didn't feel comfortable with the person. I don't think that they were a bad therapist. It just didn't feel like the right fit. And
Right,
I wasn't getting a lot of guidance from them about like, well, how does this thing called therapy work? For some people who've never been to therapy and if they've not had anyone in their family who's been to therapy and talked about it, we don't really know what it's like, because it's not like what we see on TV or in the movies or anything like that. It's not nearly that dramatic. Usually, maybe once a year, it can be that interesting, but most of the time, it's just sitting and talking and that kind of thing.
right,
So, but pretty much all therapy programs require that their students be in therapy while they are in school.
oh,
So, yes, because the idea is that they want you to be able to know what it's like to be in the client seat, but
hmm,
also to be able to look at whatever your own stuff is coming up that may get triggered through the learning material or as you
right,
start to see clients, to look at any of what we call countertransference, our thoughts and feelings that get triggered while we're sitting with the client to be able to work through that.
right,
So, when I started grad school, I started seeing a therapist probably within the first 3 months to start that requirement and ended up working with that therapist myself for maybe at least 3 or 4 years. So all the way
right,
through graduation and even when I was working on my internship post
right.
graduation.
And
And
how
so
was
that
that
was
for you?
a
Yeah. How
yeah,
was that
so
for
that
you
was
at first?
yeah, that therapist was a gay man and he was someone who also I don't know if he went to my school, but he had a similar kind of transpersonal perspective. So in
Oh,
some
okay,
ways,
okay.
he was a good model for me about like what kind of therapist do I want to be?
Right.
And so he brought in a lot of different kinds of mindfulness practices. He also practiced this modality that I've studied a little bit called Hakomi, which uses mindfulness and the body as a way to get in touch with what's happening for you on a psychological level. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that was really helpful to have that experience to begin my own self-reflective process. And then since
Right.
I've left him, I've worked with other kinds of therapists and healers to continue to support myself as I do this work to support others.
Right. Right. So, in terms of going through the learning of trans uh this therapy, um how did that affect or maybe integrate your own spirituality into your practice? Like, what is your own spiritual background? Were you brought up in a religious household? How was that experience for you?
hmm I'm going to try to answer that step by step because those were a lot of questions in one. So I was raised Catholic. I grew up in Southern California in the suburbs of Los Angeles. And, you know, I feel like I was pretty lucky as far as the kind of experience that I had compared to a lot of other queer people who grew up in organized religion, particularly Christian religions. in that there was not really any overt homophobia in the environment, or the church community that I was in. Um, but looking back on it now, I'm able to see that there were microaggressions, as there continue to be with a lot of people, for internalized homophobia that a lot of heterosexual allies have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I feel like my connection to spirit was not solely rooted in the church as a building or the religion itself. That I was, from a young child, I was always very connected with nature and with art and with music, and all of those things are still really important to me on a personal level and on a spiritual level. And and then when I moved to San Francisco to go to college, even though the college I went to was a Catholic college, they required us to take 2 religion classes, but they didn't need to be Christian based. So interestingly enough, the 2 classes that I took them like in the very first year and the very last year that I was in undergrad, and they were both very similar in that they were kind of like a overview of world religions generally. So I learned a little bit about Christianity and Catholicism, but I also learned about Buddhism and Hinduism and, Judaism and a lot of the other significant world religions. And I also went on retreats, and both these classes, they encouraged us to go out to experience other kinds of religious and spiritual practices and communities. So I know I'm just remembering this now. I totally forgot about it. But the very first class I took, I went to it was either Buddhist or Taoist, I can't remember, temple in Chinatown in San Francisco. And I remember it being upstairs, and it was very small. And I don't even know if any of the service was in English, so I didn't even really know what was going on. But I went with another classmate, and we would just sat in the back, and and we observed, and we were just quiet and respectful. And there wasn't really much engagement with the attendees. It was mostly, I guess, just sort of ritual and prayer that was happening. Um, And then in the last class that I took, we actually went on a retreat to a uh, Buddhist convent and monastery north of San Francisco, about 2 hours, called the City of 10,000 Buddhas. And we
Oh
were
yeah,
there.
I've heard of that.
Oh,
I've heard
okay.
of that
Yeah.
temple. Yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
So it's a
pretty big
really,
one, right? It's a very
yeah,
big temple, right?
it's an interesting place. Yeah. So it actually was the site itself used to be like a mental hospital that was probably built in the 50s or the 60s, because it's all very square, boxy brick buildings. That's not very pretty. But then it was shut down in the 80s during the Reagan administration, when a lot of mental hospitals and institutions were being shut down. And I believe it was sold to the community for very, very cheap, which is why they were able to move in there. So aesthetically, like, the architecture is not that attractive. But they've done a lot to decorate it. And then there's a very large room in the middle, which is the temple, and it's literally lined on the walls with 10. I don't know how many, if there's actually 10,000 Buddhas, but there's teeny tiny little Buddhas all around all the walls from floor to ceiling, and all these little cubbies. And so we went there. And so that was also really interesting to sort of be in that space and that environment, to be with the monks and the nuns who were there, like, devoting their lives to their spiritual practice. And we ate with them. They were segregated by men on one side and women on the other, in both the temple and in the dining hall. And we did qigong. We would get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning and do chanting with them. And uh, yeah, so it was just a really interesting and eye-opening experience. And then also, a lot of the members of my family, especially my dad and my uncle, had lived around the world, and my father was in the Peace Corps, and my uncle was part of World Vision and had been living in different countries. And so, they still kept and practiced their own faith and their own spiritual traditions, but that sort of showed to me that you can find spirituality on your own without having to be you don't have to go to church to find God or to find spirit, right? You can find
Right,
it on
right.
your own.
So how has this very rich experience that you've had with other spirituality, religions, what have you, informed your practice today? Like, how do you integrate them and go about that?
Yeah. Well, I would say the other the biggest kind of practice that I've had more lately in my adult life has been around earth-based spirituality. So, paganism, witchcraft, shamanic practice, or animistic traditions. And so, for me, I just say that I find spirit in everything. I find spirit in the earth and nature, as well as in other people. And so you mentioned that I do hypnotherapy, and so I have studied a style of hypnotherapy called depth hypnosis, which was founded by a woman named Isa Gucciardi at the Foundation of the Sacred Stream, which is a school in Berkeley. And depth hypnosis is a synthesis of hypnotherapy, shamanism, Buddhist psychology, and energy medicine. And so that really informs a lot of my therapy practice, but also just informs a lot of my personal practice. So, I find that is kind of where I've landed now in terms of my personal practice and my therapy practice, in terms of the different things that I bring from a spiritual perspective. But also when I work with clients, I talk to them like, well, what are your beliefs, and what's your experience, and what is important to you, and what moves you to feel connected to spirit.
Right. Yeah, which brings us to the question, like in the clients, that you see, um, do they come from all kinds of different spiritual backgrounds, or is there like a more dominant group in the clients that you see, community that you serve?
um when I first start working with people, I give them a long questionnaire, and I always ask them if they were raised any specific religious tradition or spiritual practice, what was that? And then if they have one that they practice today, what is that? Um, so most people, I mean, I would say there's not really, in terms of what someone comes from, what they were raised, it's kind of a mixed bag. There are some people who were raised some Christian religion, some people who were raised some Buddhist tradition or Jewish tradition. I haven't really had very many people that were raised in a Muslim tradition. I think, that's sort of less common just in the Bay Area, perhaps. Um, and then some people who weren't raised anything, who were
Hmm.
not even necessarily atheists, but just like nothing. Like they were literally, their parents were just not religious, not spiritual at
Right,
all.
right.
Um, and then usually when I ask what people practice today, or what um, their understanding of spirit is today, um, it's pretty generic. It's not usually very specific. A lot of people will say that they meditate, or they connect with the energy or the spirit or the power of the universe, or with nature. Um, Very few people, at least that are drawn to my practice, say that they're atheist.
Hmm.
Some people will say they just don't know.
Hmm.
Um, and then, because yoga is so popular now, a lot of people do yoga and they find some kind of spiritual connection with yoga, or
Right,
chanting
right,
practice,
right,
that kind of
right.
thing. And so, yeah, so people just come from all different backgrounds, and
Hmm.
it's I don't really draw people who are like, I want to work with you because I'm interested in exploring like what my spiritual practice is or what's going to be right for
Oh,
me.
okay. Yeah, because
Um,
I was going to ask the another question around that is that, as we know, as queers, we a lot of us has gone through some kind of trauma with organized religion.
mhm.
So I was just wondering if you have or still have, like clients who come to you to resolve those issues of
Yeah,
religious trauma.
yeah. Again, I don't draw very many people who have that experience. If anything, it might be kind of like what I was talking about before, maybe microaggressions within their religious
Hmm.
community, but
Hmm.
nothing that we would call big T trauma, as far as
Hmm.
like therapists who talk
Right,
about trauma. There's big T trauma and little T trauma. So, it's rare that I have anyone who has big T religious trauma. I mean, on the rare occasion have had some people who have had something like that, or have even been part of like cults that have had
mm,
trauma from that. But usually the people who were involved in cults, that wasn't really about homophobia. It was more just about boundary violation and physical abuse. But the
right,
religious trauma usually is about like, being told that they were a sinner and they were going to hell and God hates them and that kind of thing. Um, but also part of transpersonal psychology is just about holding the field of possibility around spirituality. And so, I ask people those questions in the questionnaire, and sometimes we may not end up talking about spirituality at all, or maybe for a long time before they come to a place where they're like, oh, I want to talk about that.
right,
Um, but I also introduce different practices that come from spiritual traditions, especially from Buddhist psychology, that may start to open people up to it. Like
right, right.
a big thing that I've been encouraging people to practice for the last few years now, um, comes from Buddhist tradition, which is the practice of loving kindness and equanimity. And equanimity is a really good practice for people who have challenging relationships with other people. They have strong conflict or aversion to other people. It's also really helpful when people are struggling with addictions or addictive habits, because
Hmm.
we're looking at aversion and attachment in the equanimity practice. And then with the loving kindness practice, traditionally, from what I've heard, most Buddhist practices around loving kindness focus on sending loving kindness to another person. But in my experience, a lot of queer people, especially, have a very harsh inner critic because they've
Hmm.
been told by so many people outside of themselves, even if it's just the world at large through media, or through, government people who are passing bills and laws that say, you don't have equal rights here, right? That
Yeah,
they think that it's not okay for me to be who I am, and I'm not good enough, and I'm not worthy of love, and I'm not worthy of success, and that kind of thing. So, with the loving kindness practice, what I usually am encouraging people to do is to send loving kindness to themselves as a way to start to cultivate self compassion,
yes.
because so many queer people can be really hard on themselves. And I tend to attract clients who are really good at being forgiving and compassionate to other people, but really hard on themselves.
Hmm.
So that's where the loving kindness and self compassion practices really come in to be helpful and
Right.
transformational.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for sharing that because on this on this show, I do a meditation when it's on, just a show by myself. And a lot of
Hmm.
my meditations are actually focused on that is actually because I do come from a Buddhist tradition.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the meditation practices that I do and I, guide other people to do are focused on, yes, you said, loving kindness first and foremost to ourselves. So, yeah,
Hmm.
that's so important. So, I'd love to now move on to talk about your amazing podcast that I was so delighted to find. Queer Spirits, your podcast, and I'd love to hear more about how it all got started and how far it's come.
Yeah, yeah. So the podcast started a little over 5 years ago. I just completed the fifth season in, let's see, where are we now in the calendar? In November of 2022 was when I finished the fifth season. And as I had mentioned earlier, I was interested in trying to reach more queer people who are on a spiritual path to offer some of my workshops and offerings, because I had developed a workshop that I had done a few times on queer initiation. And I was thinking, oh, well, how can I reach more people? Because, right, I had built this practice in the Bay Area and was pretty much just seeing people in person. And I had a pretty good network in the Bay Area. But if I wanted to do this online or travel and teach it, how would I sort of start to get the attention of other people to find the people who want to do this work, who I can help? And so at the time, I had a couple friends who actually had started their own podcasts. And so I talked to them like, oh, what's it like to do a podcast and that kind of thing. And it sounded, not too difficult. There's a little bit of a learning curve, as you may have figured, similar to what you're doing here, about just the technical setup and the production side of it. But I thought, oh, well, I know a good number of people who would be really interesting guests to be on a show to talk about queerness and spirituality. And, really just wanted to have conversations with other queer people who had found healing and support through their own spiritual practice or other support modality that might be inspirational to people who maybe don't live in areas where they have exposure to that, right? So and to inspire, like, oh, you can find healing and connection through spirituality even if you felt ostracized or rejected by your church or your spiritual community. There are other ways that you can get that support, right? So I just started by reaching out to some people that I knew and having conversations, and started doing research on a lot of people I find on social media, honestly.
Yeah,
And
and
then
I'm just so impressed with the line of guests that you've been able to interview in the past 5 years.
mhm,
And I was looking for a community like this, and I was so remember feeling so happy to have found your podcast and to have found you, and to make this connection like this. So I really want to thank you for bringing that together and continue to, connect us to like-minded souls, queer souls out there, who are into healing and raising the vibration of our planet. So yeah, and the episode that really caught my attention was that episode with Natalie Zaytouni. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. uh who talked about ensoulment and the journey of the soul, and that was such an intriguing episode. And so I want to ask you, what was your favorite episode over the 5 years, and why?
mhm, yeah. Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because, I've done over 100 episodes now. And kind of like a parent doesn't like to say they have one favorite child. I hesitate to answer this, but I think that instead of just picking one, I'll say some of my most favorite episodes or interviews that I've done is with people who live in other countries.
Hmm.
So like Natalie, who is from Israel and lives in Israel, even though she'd lived in California for a while. And then I have also interviewed people in England And then also in India, I think that that might be one of my more favorite episodes for a variety of reasons. Especially because they because of the time difference between California and India is so great. It's like, and especially I think where they are in India, it's like 13 and a half hours or something weird like that. It's not like an even hour. Um, and it was with these two people who own or who run a oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Permaculture, a
Uh-huh.
queer permaculture retreat center in Goa in India. And
And it's
uh,
queer. Oh my
and it's queer,
goodness.
yeah, yeah. And one of the people is from, oh, I can't remember what country he's from. He's from Eastern Europe. And then the other person is a woman who's Indian who lives there.
Hmm.
And so I did, because of the time difference, I did the episode. I recorded it at 10 o'clock at night my time. And also just because of India and where they were, there might have been a storm or rain or something like that. And halfway through the episode, the power went out.
Oh,
And so we lost connection. And I was like, oh, are they going to come back? Um, so, their Wi-Fi went out for maybe 5 or 10 minutes or something
oh,
like
okay.
that. And I
Uh-huh.
waited because I really was enjoying talking to them and hearing about it. Um, and they eventually came back and we talked. And yeah, but I've just really enjoyed hearing people from queer stories from queer people who live in other countries, especially countries that are so different from America, so like India and like
Right,
Israel, to
right,
hear what is it like for queer people who are wanting to explore a spiritual path in those countries, right?
right,
And
right.
so, I would say, if as far as like the recording of an episode and also just like the energy that they brought, that they were probably one of the more memorable episodes as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, have you heard any feedback from your fans? Like what have they, liked about it, or or learned, from it, themselves?
Hmm. You know, I don't know what it is about my listeners, but they're pretty quiet people. you
Okay.
know, I myself tend to be more introverted, so I don't know if because I'm more introverted, like I'm attracting other more introverted people.
But
Um,
I don't think it's you. I think it's I think we're all I mean myself included, like I don't really hear much comments from other people either, that
yeah.
are listening to the show. I think with the day and age of social media these days, we can call it social media, but in some regard, it may not be so social.
Yeah. Yeah.
People are very, especially with the pandemic that we've just experienced, or um, that people are getting more and more comfortable hiding behind their screens. They
Mm, mhm.
right, they are
Yeah.
consuming or listening to or viewing a lot of content, but not necessarily really actively engaging uh,
Yeah.
in a two-way street type of
Yeah.
way, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, and I post my episodes on social media, and I have a newsletter, and I even have private groups. I had a private Facebook group for a long time, and then I moved it to a different platform because I wanted people to feel a little bit more safe and confidentiality,
Right.
because there's been a lot of questions about confidentiality and privacy as far as Facebook goes. So I moved it to a different platform that is much more private and confidential and doesn't have advertising. And even there, like people come in and they seem to enjoy themselves, but there's not a lot of activity. And
Right.
I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not saying I'm mad, that I want more activity there. Um, and I'm not someone who tries to like generate a ton of
Right.
activity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I encourage people to share, and I ask questions every once in a while, and people share if
Right.
they want to, and if they
Yeah.
don't want to, they don't have to. But also,
Right.
I'm not someone who's like using social media to try to like sell big and sell hard.
Right.
And so I
It's
think
just
those
to serve
people,
the community. Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just like, here's a resource, here's some support for you if you want, I'm going to put out this plate of food for you and this cup of water, and if you want it, you can have it, and if you don't have
Yeah. This, which is great. It's amazing. Like, I mean, I know that, it must be a lot of work that you put in to, put the show together and finding the people. I don't even do, as much as you do, interviewing so many people. I only interview like one person a month, but that itself, it just does take work, right? So I
it.
really, applaud you for, doing this for so many years. Um,
Hmm.
so I was just curious if you have found some, very good collaborators through, your interviews with the healers, or community leaders out there. Have you met somebody through your interviews that you've done maybe events together, workshops?
Um, yes, I'm just trying to think. Only more recently, though, I'm trying to think if there's someone else that I've done stuff with. I mean, I do have a friend and a colleague that I knew even before the podcast, who I have had on the podcast. And she and I have done a workshop together online a couple years ago. We did like a winter solstice workshop, day-long workshop. And then more recently, I actually met someone through an online chanting group that I'm part of. So this was like completely separate outside of my own business practice and my own podcast. It was just something I was doing personally. Um, there's a woman in Southern California who hosts a weekly online chanting group. And through that group, I met another person there who also lives in Southern California. And we connected a little bit through that group, but it's not very interactive. It's pretty much like one way. But then I went down to Southern California for an in person event just this last summer and connected with this person that I met through the group, who is named Tanya Mark Oviedo. And I actually ended up interviewing them on the podcast. They're the last episode of the last season. And they are also a queer spiritual healer. And so we've been talking and scheming. And so we now do a monthly online virtual meditation and breathwork circle. It's on the first Saturdays of the month. And then we are also starting to think about what kinds of in person events we can do together. Since they are in Southern California and I'm in the Bay Area, we need to do a little bit more planning about who's going to travel where and which community are we going to serve and that kind of thing. And then Tanya Mark is also going to be starting to co-host the podcast with me starting this year for season 6. So yeah, so we have had quite a beautiful and lovely connection, and looking forward to see what more will come. But so other than them and the other person, there's not really been anyone else that I've necessarily collaborated with, but definitely people, that I never would have met before, and people that I was able to meet in person, who lived locally, and even people who live further away. When I've traveled to San Francisco, there's a guy who I actually did a sort of podcast interview trade with this other podcast called Minority Report, which is 3 queer
Not
black
the
men.
not the movie.
No, it's actually Minority, TEA, like spelling
Oh,
the
okay.
T, report.
Okay. Right.
Um, and one lives in Seattle, one lives in New York, and the other one lives in Philadelphia, I think. But they're all friends. And so the one who lives in New York, he came to San Francisco and I was able to meet him. And then when I was in New York in the fall, we were able to connect again. So, just connecting and meeting more people who are doing this work, and, supporting other queer people through having these different kinds of platforms.
Right. That's great. So thank you for all the work that you do. Do you have any workshops, circles coming up that you'd like the listeners, viewers to know about?
Yeah. So as I said, Tanya, Mark, and I do our virtual meditation and breathwork circle, which is on the first Saturday of the month. So our next one is going to be a week from tomorrow. So that will be February 4th, and it's at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. So that would be 12:30 Eastern time. And those are free to join. You just have to sign up on Zoom to get the link. So you can do that through my website or through Instagram. And then I'm also I'm excited to start doing in person sound baths again. I was doing sound baths virtually during COVID, and I'm going to start doing some of those here in San Francisco, and then probably Tanya, Mark, and I will be doing some in Southern California in the LA or Long Beach area, maybe later in the year. But my first one here in San Francisco is going to be, I believe, March 14th. All the
Great.
details are not ironed out
On
yet,
your
but
website.
people
Oh,
will
not on
stay
your, okay. I
tuned.
was going to say,
Yeah.
will we find it on your website? But probably at
You
some
will
point
when,
we will.
yes, yeah. And
Yes.
I'll post it on my socials as well.
Social as well. Right, right, right. So with the sound bath, like do you play some specific instrument and chanting and meditation? Is that what you do?
Yeah, so I take it from a kind of mindfulness practice perspective, as well as bringing in some optional ritual aspects of it too. So I may have people think about what kind of intention they want to bring to the meditation that they go through during the sound bath. So it could be I want to release something, stress, anxiety, pain from my body. Or maybe I want to call in peace, serenity. I want to call in joy. I want to call in gratitude, that kind of thing. Try to keep it very simple. And then I guide people through a simple breathing exercise using some of my hypnotherapy background to guide people into just a state of relaxation. And then through a variety of different instruments and some recorded sound, usually just like nature sounds that are recorded. Um, Sometimes a recorded song, but usually not. And I also have been interested in starting to layer electronic music that I make myself in with
Oh,
it.
okay.
But for the most part, it's acoustic instruments. So it could be different kinds of singing bowls, drums, rattles, flutes. Um, I have an instrument called a kotamo, which is a stringed instrument that is kind of like a koto or a harp sort of mashup kind of thing.
Right.
There's also some hand pan drums that have melody on them. And, usually it's a combination of improvisation with some already planned kind of soundscapes. And then
Right.
I may bring in a chant or a song towards the end. And then I encourage people to, if they want to share their experience, because sometimes they may go into a kind of reverie, like a dream, or they may have a journey where they have some kind of insight about the intention that they initially focused on. And so I invite people to share that. Because, speaking and sharing out loud, especially in a small group, can be really powerful and
Mm-hmm.
transformational and really like
Yeah.
solidify the experience for you too.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, that's very much part of what we do in our the modality that I'm in. I'm in this
Hmm.
healing community, and we do song and dance as well.
Hmm.
Um, and our modality is what we call Dao song and Dao dance. Connecting with
Hmm.
the Dao and then channeling that frequency into the performance. So yeah, thank you, Nick. And so one last question I'd like to ask you before we wrap up is what do you do for your own self care? In I can only imagine your work can be quite um a lot to take in, from
Yeah,
supporting
yeah.
so many individuals. Yeah. So what do you do for your own self-care?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of things that I do automatically that I don't even think of since I've been doing so many different things and I just kind of like are part of my daily life. But as far as more significant things, I think that exercise is really important for me. I try to do yoga once or twice a week, and I find that to be really helpful because, the purpose of yoga primarily is to calm the mind, right? It's not necessarily about the body, it's about how do you support the mind to come to rest and to ease through the vehicle of the body, through the asana, through the poses. Um, so I find that doing yoga is really helpful. And it's not only for my mind, but for my body as well. As most of us in our culture, we sit in a chair at our job most of the time. And so sitting and not moving very much and poor posture is not helpful. Um, and then music, as I talked about, doing the sound bath, music is a really big part of my life. And whether it's singing like in the chanting group that I talked about or playing music. I also play the piano for a hobby, and or just listening to music. I listen to music a lot. I listen to work when I walk to and from work, and that just helps me sort of center and ground and prepare to focus as I go to work. And then when I leave work, it sort of helps me kind of unwind and let go of my day.
Right.
And then walking also is really good self-care.
Right.
And
So
and then
yeah.
also
So
staying connected with friends and family and community and getting hugs and all
of
that
course,
kind of stuff.
connection. Yes, the
Yeah.
human connection. Yes. Do you have a any kind of like spiritual ritual or practices, meditations, chants that you do as part of your self-care regime?
Not regularly. No, I know that there's a lot of people out there who really tout the importance of having a daily practice, but I also really try to encourage people to just get the practice in where and when they can. So whether that's a 3-minute mindfulness practice while you're sitting on the bus on the way to work, or while you're in the shower, getting coming home from your day. Um, so, I think that one of the things that's really important for me is getting out into nature, especially living in a city. There are parks here and that kind of thing, but I really enjoy sort of getting out of the city and a little bit further away from the hubbub.
Right, right,
Connecting to nature is really important, I think, for my nervous system. So I try to do that when I can. It's a little harder in the winter time.
right.
Um, so yeah.
So how do you describe your mystic connection then? Like when do you tap into that?
Um, I don't know. It's not really like it's an on and off switch. It's kind of like a dimmer switch, right? And depending on my state of mind and my attention and my focus, I may have it on more than others. Um, but I'm really drawn to trees and I'm really drawn to water. So being someplace where there's a lot of trees and a lot of water can be really helpful, and just being quiet and connecting and you know sticking my nose in a tree or splashing my face with water helps me connect to just the mysticism that is the earth and the ways that it
Right,
supports me.
right. Great. So thank you so much, Nick, for your time. I I hope that more people will check out especially your podcast. It's really such a treasure trove of so much wisdom and sharing and experiences. I thank you again for the work that you do as a healer and also as a spiritual community organizer. So we need more people like you, and I can't wait to meet some of the people that you have connected to, so that I can learn more about the work they do as well. So once again, Nick, thank you so much. Do you have any final words before we say goodbye to our viewers?
Just thank you for having me and for holding this space and, creating this channel that you are holding as well. I feel definitely a kinship to you, and that we're, you know, two of many of the queer people on the spiritual path who are holding our flames in the dark to support people. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's so well put, and it's such an honor to be able to do something simple, but hopefully make a difference to somebody out there. So thank you again, Nick, for joining us, and to all the listeners and viewers out there. Thank you for listening. And this is Desiree and Nick signing off. Take care, and be queer, be love, and be the light that the world needs. See you next time. Thank you.